Hi everyone. It was just past midnight when the silence over southern Palestine was torn apart by a chilling sound, the wail of air raid sirens. For most Israelis, the sirens had become a grim routine, a background noise of war. But this night was different. Radar operators inside the Central Command Center stared in disbelief as a massive object streaked across their screens. Its trajectory was clear, coming from deep within Yemen, locked on to a high-value target inside Israel's southern military zone. The order was immediate: activate the Iron Dome. Dozens of interceptor missiles roared into the night sky, leaving trails of fire like arrows against the darkness. Yet one by one they failed. The incoming missile did not slow, it did not waver. It cut through Israel's vaunted air defenses like a blade through paper. Then came the impact. A blinding flash lit up the horizon, followed by a thunderous explosion that shook buildings for miles around. The ground convulsed as if struck by an earthquake. At the heart of the blast zone lay the Israeli Air Force's Southern Command Base, home to elite fighter squadrons, training facilities, and the very pilots who carried out daily sorties over Gaza. In a single night, Israel had lost not just soldiers, but the irreplaceable elite who formed the brain and muscle of its aerial dominance. For the first time in decades, Israel had faced what it had always feared most: a direct, catastrophic breach of its aerial supremacy. And the night was only just beginning. As dawn crept over the smoldering ruins, the true scale of the devastation began to emerge. Emergency crews clawed through twisted metal and shattered concrete, searching desperately for survivors. What they found instead were bodies, scores of them, buried beneath the wreckage of what only hours earlier had been the beating heart of Israel's Air Force. Preliminary reports confirmed the unthinkable. Over 120 pilots and Air Force technicians were dead. Many of them were among Israel's most seasoned aviators, men and women trained for years, entrusted with flying the nation's cutting-edge F-35 stealth fighters and F-16 squadrons. In a single night, Israel had lost not just soldiers, but the irreplaceable elite who formed the brain and muscle of its aerial dominance. The scenes of chaos were almost surreal. Charred remains of fighter jets lay scattered like broken toys. Black smoke billowed from hangars where multi-million-dollar aircraft had been reduced to ashes. A command center, once buzzing with orders and strategy, was now silent, its walls collapsed into rubble. Survivors described horror unlike anything they had endured in years of combat.
"The blast was so strong it lifted me off the ground," one wounded officer recounted, his face pale and bandaged. "When I opened my eyes, everything was fire. I saw colleagues, friends, screaming, trapped. We tried to pull them out, but the flames swallowed them." For Israel's Air Force, it was more than just tragedy. It was decapitation. The loss of such a large portion of its flight crews was a wound that no quick mobilization could heal. Training replacements would take years. The sudden void left behind meant that daily air missions over Gaza, Lebanon, and beyond could be severely crippled. Israel, a nation that had prided itself on an aura of invincibility in the skies, now faced a nightmare it had never anticipated: the possibility of flying blind. In Tel Aviv, the news struck like an earthquake. Within minutes of the attack, the Israeli Prime Minister convened an emergency meeting of the Security Cabinet. The atmosphere was tense, the room heavy with disbelief and fury. Generals, intelligence chiefs, and ministers sat in stunned silence as casualty reports poured in. The Prime Minister's words were sharp, his voice shaking with controlled rage. This was not just an attack, it was an act of war, and it will not be unanswered. Yet behind the strong rhetoric, cracks were already forming. Military advisors admitted what few had dared to say aloud. Israel's most advanced defense systems, Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow, had all failed in unison. A single missile had done what no regional enemy had ever accomplished, pierced Israel's legendary shield and struck at its very core. The revelation sent shockwaves across the Israeli public. Families of Air Force personnel flooded hospitals, desperate for news of loved ones. Outside military bases, crowds gathered, some chanting for revenge, others demanding accountability. "Where was our protection?" one grieving mother cried on live television. "How can the world's most advanced army fail to protect its own?" The political fallout was immediate. Opposition leaders accused the government of negligence, calling the disaster a symptom of arrogance and overconfidence. Rumors swirled of resignations among senior defense officials. For the first time in decades, Israel's military supremacy was being openly questioned by its own people. Still, the cabinet's conclusion was unanimous. Israel would strike back. The only question was how, and how far the retaliation would go. For decades, Israel's greatest strength lay in the skies. Its pilots, its warplanes, and its unmatched training programs gave it dominance over every battlefield in the region. That dominance had now been shattered in a single night. Military analysts were quick to point out the grim reality. The loss of 122 pilots and technicians was not just a number, it was a strategic collapse. Each pilot represented years of training, millions of dollars in investment, and experience that could not be replaced overnight. Without them, flight rotations would shrink, missions would be delayed, and Israel's capacity to project power across multiple fronts would erode.
The damage was not just operational, it was psychological. Enemy groups across the region, from Gaza to Lebanon to Syria, were already emboldened. Celebrations erupted in Beirut, Sana'a, and even in refugee camps across the Middle East. Propaganda channels declared the strike a divine victory, proof that Israel's so-called invincibility was nothing more than a myth. In Washington and European capitals, alarm bells rang. Western allies worried that Israel's weakened air force could destabilize the region, emboldening not only resistance groups, but also rival states. If Israel loses control of the skies, the balance of power in the Middle East shifts overnight, warned one U.S. defense official. Inside Israel, Air Force commanders faced an impossible choice: push inexperienced cadets into combat or scale back operations altogether. Both options carried devastating consequences. For a country that had built its identity around air superiority, the idea of losing that edge was unthinkable. And yet, the cracks were already showing. The once unchallenged skies above Israel had become uncertain, vulnerable, and full of questions no one in Tel Aviv dared to answer. The funerals had barely ended when Israel's war rooms lit up with activity. Maps were unrolled, targets marked, and options laid out with deadly precision. For the Israeli Defense Forces, restraint was no longer the question, only the scale of retaliation. Intelligence reports identified missile launch sites deep inside Yemen, buried in mountain ranges and hidden within civilian areas. Striking them would be costly and complex, requiring long-range missions across hostile skies. Yet the generals insisted, if we do nothing, our enemies will smell blood. They will come for us again. In the corridors of power, divisions grew sharper. Hawks demanded a massive retaliatory campaign, not only against Yemen, but against Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, hoping to reassert dominance through overwhelming fire. Others cautioned that such a move could ignite a multi-front war that Israel might not survive in its current weakened state. Outside Israel, the world braced. American aircraft carriers repositioned in the Mediterranean. European diplomats pleaded for calm, urging Tel Aviv to show restraint. Meanwhile, Tehran praised the strike as a turning point in the struggle against Israeli aggression, raising fears that Iran itself might soon be drawn openly into the conflict. On the ground in Gaza and Beirut, people waited with dread and anticipation. Some stocked food and supplies, convinced the next round of airstrikes was imminent. Others celebrated, convinced that the balance of power had finally shifted against Israel. And in Yemen, the very architects of the missile strike appeared on television, smiling defiantly, promising more if Israel dared to retaliate. Their words echoed like a challenge across the region. The skies are no longer yours. If you strike us again, you will see how vulnerable you truly are. For the first time in decades, Israel stood at a precipice, forced to confront a truth it had long denied, that its reign over the skies was no longer guaranteed. And as its leaders weighed their next move, the Middle East stood still, waiting for the storm to break.